"Do not touch him," the alien physician said, his voice shaking just enough for everyone in the emergency ward to hear. "His core temperature is still climbing. Another 2 degrees, and he will ignite." Nobody moved. Nurses froze beside their diagnostic stations. A security officer instinctively took one slow step backward. Every monitor surrounding Daniel Brooks flashed the same crimson warning that no one on Helix Medical Station had ever seen attached to a living patient. Biological thermal cascade. Survival probability, less than 1%. Daniel blinked at the ceiling lights, squinting as though he had simply woken from a long nap. His head felt heavy. His skin burned beneath the thin hospital blanket. His joints ached in the familiar, miserable way they always had whenever he caught something during flu season back home in Ohio. He swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. "Can somebody get me some water?" he asked, his voice raspy but calm. The silence that followed was unsettling. Dr. Cayley slowly lowered the scanner in his 6-fingered hand without taking his eyes off the display. "Water," he repeated. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, ice water if you've got it. My whole body feels like an oven." The translator converted the sentence perfectly, but the room somehow became even quieter. A younger alien nurse leaned toward Cayley's and whispered something so quickly that Daniel could not follow it. Whatever she said made the doctor's expression tighten. "Mr. Brooks," Cayley's asked carefully, "you are aware your internal temperature is currently 104.7 degrees Fahrenheit." Daniel gave a tired shrug. "Sounds about right. I had one that hit 105 when I was 12. Mom sat next to me all night, making me drink Gatorade." 3 different scanners immediately pivoted toward him, as if the sentence itself had broken the laws of biology. Cayley stared. "You survived?" Daniel frowned. "Sure. It sucked, but I'm still here." Around the room, specialists began pulling up archived medical files, comparing readings against every known species in the Galactic Health Registry. None of them possessed a biological process remotely similar to this. Across more than 400 documented civilizations, rising body temperature beyond a narrow threshold meant irreversible organ failure. There was no recovery phase, no waiting it out, no childhood memories attached to it. It was the final stage before death. Yet the human lying in front of them was asking whether somebody could also bring him a couple of aspirin because he had a splitting headache. Cayley slowly approached the bedside. "Daniel, have you experienced episodes like this many times?" Daniel let out a weak laugh before coughing into his elbow. "I mean, not every year. Depends. Sometimes the flu. Sometimes strep throat. Couple of nasty viruses when I was a kid. You ride it out, stay hydrated, call your doctor if it gets worse." Every word deepened the confusion spreading through the room. One physician quietly backed away from the bed and opened an encrypted channel to the Central Academy of Xenobiology. Another requested immediate consultation from the Galactic Medical Council. Within 60 seconds, Daniel Brooks had become the most important patient in known space, and he had absolutely no idea why. He shifted uncomfortably beneath the blanket, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Look," he said with an apologetic smile, "I know I'm making extra work for everybody, but honestly, I probably just need a day off and some chicken soup." Nobody laughed. Nobody even smiled. They simply watched the human as though they had discovered a star calmly burning, where every law of the universe insisted only ashes should remain. And for the very first time in galactic history, the greatest medical minds ever assembled began asking a question no textbook had prepared them to answer. What if a fever was never a sign that a human body was failing? What if it was proof that it was fighting back? By sunrise on Earth, Daniel Brooks had become the most discussed patient in the known galaxy, although he remained completely unaware of it. He lay in the same hospital bed wrapped in a cooling blanket, staring at a ceiling filled with softly glowing panels that shifted colors every few minutes. He reached for the glass of ice water sitting beside him, took a slow drink, and sighed with relief. "That actually helps," he muttered. Dr. Cayley's watched from the other side of the room through a transparent observation wall. Every few seconds, another report appeared across the holographic display floating in front of him. Body temperature, 104.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Heart rhythm, stable. Oxygen saturation, normal. Neurological activity, normal. Cellular damage, none detected. The numbers refused to cooperate with everything he had studied during 2 centuries of medical practice. A voice interrupted his thoughts. The delegation from the Galactic Medical Council has arrived. Kaylee's turned toward the entrance as 4 specialists stepped inside, wearing the silver insignia reserved for the highest scientific authority in the Alliance. Leading them was Professor Lyra Sun, an elderly physician whose research had rewritten modern xenobiology decades earlier. She studied Daniel through the observation glass before speaking. Is the data authentic? Kaylee's nodded without hesitation. Every reading has been verified independently 6 times. She folded her arms. And he remains conscious? He asked whether we have chicken noodle soup. The professor stared at him for several seconds before quietly saying, "He is joking. Apparently, while his body is approaching lethal thermal failure, according to every model we possess." She walked closer to the glass. Daniel noticed the growing audience and offered an awkward wave. "Am I famous now?" he called out with a tired smile. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Kaylee's entered the room carrying another scanner. "Daniel, I would like to ask you a few questions if you feel up to it." "Sure, as long as none of them involve needles." "Have you recently consumed any chemical stimulants?" "No." "Experimental medication?" "No." "Military enhancement therapy?" Daniel actually laughed despite his headache. "I fix environmental control systems on cargo stations. The most dangerous thing I handle is industrial coolant." Lyra exchanged another puzzled glance with Kaylee's. "Do humans routinely continue ordinary conversation while experiencing this condition?" she asked quietly. Kaylee's looked back at Daniel, who had pulled out his personal communicator and was scrolling through messages from coworkers asking when he would be back on shift. "Apparently they do." Daniel looked up again. "Actually, can somebody tell my supervisor I am not skipping work? He is probably wondering where I disappeared to." Lyra blinked. "You are concerned about employment?" "Well, sure. Rent still exists." One of the younger alien researchers whispered. "His cognition has not deteriorated at all." Another added, "There is no panic response." They expected confusion, delirium, or collapse. Instead, they found a man mildly annoyed that he had become sick during a busy workweek. Kaylee's finally placed the scanner on the bedside table. "Daniel, when your temperature rises like this, what do human physicians usually tell you?" Daniel answered without thinking. "Rest. Drink plenty of fluids. Keep an eye on it. If it keeps climbing or breathing gets difficult, then you head to the hospital." Every alien in the room froze. Those instructions sounded less like emergency intervention and more like routine household advice. Professor Lyra slowly turned toward the assembled specialists. "Do you understand what this means?" Nobody spoke. She answered her own question. An entire civilization has been living alongside a biological mechanism that every other species would classify as unsurvivable. They do not fear it because they grew up with it. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not driven by confusion. It was something much deeper. For the first time, the greatest physicians in the galaxy realized they might not be observing a medical emergency at all. They might be witnessing one of humanity's oldest survival instincts quietly doing exactly what it had evolved to do. By the second day, Daniel Brooks was no longer just a patient. He had become a classified research priority. Every incoming transport to Helix Medical Station carried another expert, another specialist, another scientist convinced they would be the one to explain the impossible. Instead, every one of them walked into the same room, looked at the same monitors, and left with more questions than answers. Daniel sat upright in bed, looking noticeably better than the day before. The pounding headache had faded to a dull ache, and his appetite had started to return. He looked toward Dr. Kaylee's as another tray was delivered. "Please tell me that is actual food this time." Kaylee's glanced at the tray. The nutrition department attempted to recreate something called grilled cheese and tomato soup. Daniel smiled. "Whoever did that deserves a raise." Kaylee's watched in complete disbelief as Daniel happily took his first bite. According to every physiological model in the Galactic Medical Registry, his body should have been shutting down. Instead, it seemed to be asking for lunch. Professor Lyra Sun entered the room carrying a thick digital archive. "Daniel, may I ask you something more personal?" He nodded. "Sure. How old were you when you first experienced this condition?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Probably 5 or 6. My parents used to keep a thermometer in the bathroom cabinet. Every kid gets sick sooner or later." Lyra paused. "Every child?" "Pretty much." She looked down at her notes before asking another question. "Were your parents frightened?" Daniel laughed softly. Only if the fever got really high. Most of the time, Mom just stayed home from work, made soup, checked my temperature every couple of hours, and made sure I drank enough water. Dad would complain that I always picked football season to get sick. Several researchers quietly exchanged stunned looks. One finally whispered, "Entire family care protocols normalized." Another added, "Their civilization developed domestic routines around an event we classify as terminal." Daniel overheard enough to raise an eyebrow. "Wait, you are telling me nobody else gets fevers?" The room became uncomfortably quiet. Kaylee's answered honestly, "No known intelligent species does. Elevated thermal response beyond a very narrow range destroys cellular regulation. Survival has never been documented." Daniel blinked twice. Seriously? Seriously. He leaned back against his pillow, trying to process what he had just heard. "So, if one of you catches an infection," Professor Lyra finished the sentence for him, "either our immune systems eliminate it without significant thermal elevation, or we do not survive." Daniel slowly shook his head. "That is rough." The simplicity of his response caught everyone off guard. He was not boasting. He was not acting superior. He genuinely felt sorry for them. Kaylee's activated another scan as Daniel continued eating. Something unexpected appeared across the display. The concentration of inflammatory markers had already begun falling. Damaged tissue was repairing itself faster than anticipated. White blood cell activity remained elevated, but every measurable indicator suggested recovery had already begun. "Professor," Kaylee said quietly, "his body is resolving the infection." Lyra stepped closer to the monitor. Without pharmaceutical intervention, only fluids, nutrition, and observation. She stared at the changing graphs for several seconds before whispering, almost to herself, the fever was never destroying him. It was creating the conditions necessary to protect him. Around the observation deck, every conversation stopped. Researchers who had spent entire careers believing they understood advanced biology suddenly found themselves confronting an uncomfortable possibility. Humanity had not survived despite this extraordinary response. Humanity had survived because of it. And somewhere across Earth, millions of parents were probably telling a child to stay in bed, drink plenty of water, and get some rest, never realizing that what seemed like ordinary family advice would overturn centuries of accepted galactic science. By the end of the week, Helix Medical Station no longer resembled a hospital. It felt more like the center of the largest scientific investigation in galactic history. Laboratories that normally studied stellar pathogens and deep space biology had quietly redirected their resources toward a single human patient who was now sitting comfortably near a window, watching cargo ships drift past the station. Daniel Brooks sipped hot coffee and looked over at Dr. Kaylee's. "I appreciate everybody checking on me, but I promise I am feeling a lot better." Kaylee's glanced at the latest scan and answered honestly, "That is precisely what none of us can explain." Daniel chuckled. "Trust me, I cannot explain taxes either. Sometimes things just work." The joke earned another round of confused looks from the alien researchers gathered around the observation table. Humor, like fever, seemed to function differently in humans. Professor Lyra Sun had assembled specialists from immunology, evolutionary biology, molecular chemistry, and comparative genetics. One by one, they presented theories, each supported by elegant equations and decades of respected research. One scientist believed humans possessed microscopic thermal regulators hidden inside their cells. Another suggested an undiscovered energy source was protecting Daniel's organs. A third proposed that Earth's gravity had permanently altered human proteins in ways no other species had experienced. Every hypothesis sounded convincing until new data arrived and quietly dismantled it. "The inflammatory markers are declining exactly as predicted," Kaylee's reported. "Cell repair continues to accelerate." Another researcher frowned at the display. "Then our model should show permanent tissue damage." "It does not. The metabolic cost should leave him physically exhausted for weeks." Daniel looked up from his coffee. "Actually, I was thinking about taking a walk later if that is okay." The room became silent again. Lyra slowly approached Daniel with another question. "Would you describe yourself as unusually healthy among humans?" He shook his head. "Not really. I catch colds once in a while. Allergies every spring. Broke my wrist riding a bike when I was 14. Pretty average, honestly." "Average," Lyra repeated softly. "Yes, ma'am." She looked around the conference table. We have spent 4 days searching for an extraordinary explanation. Perhaps we should consider an ordinary one. Several researchers turned toward her. Meaning? Asked Kayleigh. Lyra folded her hands. We continue assuming Daniel is exceptional. Yet every answer he gives suggests the opposite. He believes his experience is completely normal because, on Earth, it is. The words settled over the room with unexpected weight. One researcher immediately requested access to public human medical literature. Another began downloading pediatric health recommendations from Earth hospitals. Within minutes, the main display filled with documents written not for elite physicians, but for parents, school nurses, and family doctors. The advice repeated the same simple instructions again and again. Encourage fluids. Monitor temperature. Allow plenty of rest. Seek additional care only if symptoms worsen. Kayleigh stared at the screen in disbelief. This information is publicly available? Daniel nodded. Of course. You can find most of it online. Another physician quietly asked, humans simply share this knowledge. Daniel smiled. Why would we not? Nobody answered. They had expected humanity to guard such biological advantages as classified state secrets. Instead, they discovered millions of parents freely discussing fever management while waiting to pick up groceries or watching Little League games. Kayleigh slowly lowered his tablet as one realization connected every unanswered question from the past several days. Humanity had never hidden its greatest biological mystery. The galaxy had simply never thought something so ordinary was worth paying attention to. Ironically, the breakthrough did not come from the galaxy's most advanced artificial intelligence or the largest medical database ever assembled. It came from a simple comparison that should have been made on the very first day. Professor Lyra stood before a wall-sized display showing 2 timelines side by side. On the left appeared the progression of a common bacterial infection in nearly every known intelligent species. On the right was Daniel Brooks. The differences were impossible to ignore. In every alien species, invading microbes multiplied until medication or immune suppression ended the conflict. Body temperature remained remarkably stable because even a slight increase threatened catastrophic cellular failure. Human biology followed an entirely different script. The moment Daniel's immune system recognized the infection, it deliberately reset the body's internal thermostat. His temperature climbed. His metabolism accelerated. Specialized immune cells multiplied at astonishing speed, while the invading microbes steadily lost their ability to reproduce. Run the simulation again, Kayleigh said quietly. The computer obeyed. The outcome remained unchanged. Increase temperature. Accelerate immune response. Slow microbial growth. Preserve healthy tissue. Recovery. One young researcher looked genuinely unsettled. The elevated temperature is not collateral damage, she whispered. It is part of the treatment. Another scientist slowly nodded. The body is prescribing its own medicine. Daniel happened to walk into the conference room, carrying another cup of coffee, just as the realization settled over everyone. Did I miss something? He asked. Kayleigh turned toward him with an expression Daniel had never seen before. It was no longer confusion. It was admiration. Daniel, your fever was never your enemy. Daniel smiled. That is what my mom always said. Every head in the room turned toward him at once. She told you this? Lyra asked. Sure, Daniel replied. She always said a fever means your body is working hard. You respect it, keep an eye on it, but you do not panic unless it gets dangerously high. Kayleigh slowly lowered his tablet. Your mother understood this? Daniel laughed. So did my family doctor. Honestly, most parents back home know the basics. The silence that followed carried an entirely different feeling than before. It was not disbelief anymore. It was humility. For generations, alien medicine had classified rising body temperature as an irreversible medical disaster. Entire treatment protocols focused on suppressing even the smallest increase before irreversible collapse could begin. Humanity had reached a completely different conclusion thousands of years earlier, not because humans possessed superior technology, but because they had spent centuries simply watching their children grow up. Lyra opened another set of files containing Earth medical research dating back hundreds of years. Each generation had refined the understanding a little more. Scientists had identified immune signaling molecules, inflammatory responses, and the complex communication between the brain and the body's defense systems. None of it had been secret. None of it had required advanced interstellar laboratories. It had grown from ordinary observation, patient care, and countless family physicians asking careful questions over many generations. Daniel looked around the room and scratched the back of his neck. I hate to interrupt what looks like a really important meeting, but am I cleared to leave tomorrow? My apartment probably smells terrible after sitting empty all week. A few researchers actually laughed for the first time. Kaylee smiled as well. We will discuss discharge soon. Then he looked back toward the massive display where one sentence had quietly replaced every previous warning label. Human fever is not evidence of biological failure. Human fever is an adaptive defense mechanism. Beneath that sentence, another notification appeared automatically as the station updated its medical database. Recommended action for future human patients. Observe carefully before attempting intervention. The galaxy had spent centuries trying to understand how humanity survived so many impossible environments. Now the answer had begun revealing itself in the most ordinary way imaginable. The human body had never waited for rescue. It had learned to fight for itself. Daniel Brooks expected to spend his final afternoon on Helix Medical Station signing discharge forms. Instead, he found himself sitting inside the largest medical conference chamber on the station, with more than 200 physicians watching him drink a bottle of water. He looked around the room and smiled awkwardly. I have to admit, this is probably the weirdest audience I have ever had. A few of the younger researchers smiled back, but most remained completely focused on the live biological display floating above him. Every heartbeat, every breath, every change in body chemistry appeared in real time. Professor Lyra stepped to the center of the room. We believed we had solved the mystery, she began. We believed fever itself explained human resilience. We were wrong. Fever is only one chapter in a much larger story. Another display appeared beside the first. It traced Daniel's immune activity over the previous several days. Colored markers showed different defensive cells appearing one after another, each responding to the infection with remarkable coordination. Kaylee's pointed toward a bright cluster moving across the image. These specialized cells encountered the invading organism only once. He tapped the display again. Yet they have already begun storing molecular information that will allow a faster response if the same organism ever returns. Murmurs spread throughout the room. An elderly microbiologist slowly stood. You are saying the human immune system remembers? Not metaphorically, Kaylee's answered. Biologically. The chamber became quiet again. Every known intelligent species possessed immune defenses, but once an infection ended, the response largely returned to its original state. Humanity appeared to be doing something completely different. Daniel listened for another minute before raising his hand like a student in school. You mean antibodies? Every eye turned toward him. Yes, Kaylee's replied. That is the human term. Daniel shrugged. We learn about those in middle school. Several researchers looked at one another with expressions somewhere between disbelief and embarrassment. Information capable of reshaping galactic medicine was apparently considered basic education on Earth. Professor Lyra looked directly at Daniel. When you were a child, were vaccinations common? Of course, Daniel answered. Everybody I knew got them. And your parents accepted this? Daniel frowned slightly. Why would they not? Vaccines help your immune system recognize diseases before you actually get sick. The room fell silent once again. One researcher quickly searched public Earth educational material, children's health websites, public service announcements, school science lessons. The information was everywhere, explained in plain language using cartoons, simple diagrams, and family-friendly examples. Humanity had spent generations teaching children how their own immune systems learned from experience. Kaylee slowly leaned back in his chair. We have spent centuries building larger hospitals. Lyra nodded thoughtfully. Humans spent centuries teaching their own bodies to become better teachers. Daniel laughed softly. I do not think anybody back home would describe it like that. Perhaps they should, Lyra replied. She looked across the conference hall as new simulations filled the central display. The station's predictive models now suggested that humanity's extraordinary adaptability extended far beyond fever. Every recovered infection slightly improved future survival. Every exposure strengthened biological memory. Every generation expanded medical knowledge while simultaneously passing practical experience through families, schools, and physicians. Daniel quietly watched the displays before speaking again. Honestly, most people do not spend much time thinking about this. You get sick. You stay home. You recover. Then life goes on. Kaylee smiled. Perhaps that is exactly why we failed to understand your species. Daniel tilted his head. How do you figure? Because we search for miracles hidden inside laboratories, Kaylee's answered. We never thought to look inside ordinary human life. Around the chamber, nobody argued. They had arrived expecting to document an impossible patient. Instead, they had uncovered an entire civilization whose greatest biological strengths had been quietly hiding inside childhood memories, family traditions, classroom lessons, and conversations that millions of humans considered too ordinary to mention. Daniel was officially cleared to leave the following morning, but before he packed his small overnight bag, he stepped into a quiet communication booth overlooking the station's docking ring. Earth filled half the screen as the connection finally stabilized. A familiar face appeared almost instantly. Well, there you are, his mother said with a warm smile. I was starting to think you forgot how to call home. Daniel laughed. Sorry, Mom. Things got a little crazy. Your supervisor called 2 days ago. He said half the station thinks you are part of some classified research project. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Honestly, I think I accidentally became one. She smiled the same patient smile he had seen his entire life. Are you feeling better? Much better. Fever finally broke yesterday. Good. I told you that you would bounce back. Daniel shrugged. Turns out everybody here thought the fever was the dangerous part. His mother looked surprised. Really? Yeah. Apparently none of them have anything like it. She blinked once before saying the most ordinary sentence imaginable. Honey, a fever is just your body doing its job. You still have to pay attention to it, but it is trying to help you. Daniel nodded. That is exactly what I told them. Neither of them noticed that Dr. Kaylee's and Professor Lyra had quietly stopped outside the booth while waiting to escort Daniel to his final evaluation. They had not intended to eavesdrop, but the conversation reached them through the partially open door. There was no dramatic revelation, no classified medical terminology, no secret military knowledge. Just a mother repeating the same advice she had probably given her son since kindergarten. Did you stay hydrated? She asked. Yes, Mom. Did you actually rest? Daniel hesitated. Mostly. She laughed. That means no. Daniel grinned. You know me too well. Kaylee's looked toward Lyra without saying a word. He had expected humanity's biological advantage to be preserved inside elite universities or government laboratories. Instead, it was being passed from one generation to the next through family conversations that lasted less than 5 minutes. When the call ended, Daniel stepped out carrying his small bag. Ready? He asked. Neither physician answered immediately. Finally, Lyra spoke. May I ask one final question? Sure. Everything your mother just told you. Is that considered specialized medical advice on Earth? Daniel looked genuinely confused. No, that is just mom stuff. Kaylee slowly lowered his eyes for a moment. Across hundreds of worlds, billions of parents loved their children. They comforted them when they became ill. But only humanity had evolved alongside a biological defense system that families had learned to understand through everyday experience. Earth had built an entire culture around recognizing illness without fearing every symptom. They respected the body's warning signs while also trusting its remarkable ability to heal. Later that afternoon, Professor Lyra addressed the assembled researchers one final time before they returned to their respective worlds. Our greatest mistake was assuming extraordinary discoveries always require extraordinary explanations. We searched for hidden laboratories, forbidden technology, and impossible mutations. She paused before looking toward Daniel, who was signing his discharge paperwork with the same casual attitude he had shown since arriving. Instead, we found a man whose understanding of his own biology began at his family's dinner table. No one in the room argued. For the first time in their careers, the brightest medical minds in the galaxy realized that humanity's greatest strengths were not mysterious because humans kept them secret. They were mysterious because humans had lived with them for so long that they no longer recognized how extraordinary they truly were. 3 weeks after Daniel Brooks walked out of Helix Medical Station carrying nothing more than a backpack and a travel mug, the Galactic Medical Council convened an emergency session unlike any in its history. Representatives from hundreds of worlds filled the circular chamber, not to debate a war or a trade dispute, but to decide whether centuries of accepted medical doctrine should be rewritten. Professor Lyra Sin stood at the center podium while a massive display floated behind her. The first slide showed the old protocol. Elevated thermal response, immediate suppression required. The second slide displayed Daniel's complete recovery timeline. The third contained thousands of verified human medical records voluntarily shared by hospitals, universities, and public health agencies across Earth. No classified files. No military archives. Everything had been available for anyone willing to ask. A council member from the Orion cluster leaned forward. "Professor, are you asking us to believe that an entire civilization has been openly publishing knowledge capable of transforming modern medicine?" Lyra answered without hesitation. "I am not asking you to believe it. I am showing you the evidence." Another delegate spoke. "Then why did none of us recognize its importance?" Kayles rose from his seat before Lyra could answer. "Because we translated their language, but never their experience. Every time humans said the word fever, our systems automatically interpreted it as catastrophic thermal collapse. We assumed they were describing the same phenomenon we feared. We were wrong from the beginning." The chamber fell quiet as historical records appeared on the central display. Decades of diplomatic conversations, medical exchanges, human educational materials, children's science books, family health guides. The information had crossed interstellar borders for years, yet every translation algorithm had quietly distorted one ordinary word into something entirely different. A linguistics specialist stood slowly. "Our translators did not fail." Kayles nodded. "Our assumptions did." Another screen appeared, this one displaying the Council's proposed revision. The previous medical classification was struck through with a single line. In its place appeared a new official entry. Human fever. Adaptive immune response unique to Terran biology. Observation and supportive care recommended unless additional complications develop. Around the chamber, delegates read the words in complete silence. A physician from a distant aquatic civilization finally broke it. "We are naming an official galactic medical condition using a human word." Lyra smiled gently. "There is no more accurate term." The motion proceeded to a formal vote. Lights illuminated across the chamber one after another. Approval. 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 Within minutes the result became unanimous. Across thousands of hospitals connected to the Galactic Medical Network, software updates began downloading automatically. Diagnostic systems that once treated elevated human temperature as immediate terminal failure quietly replaced their emergency alerts with new guidance based on Earth's own medical understanding. On Helix Medical Station, a young nurse watched the update finish installing before smiling to herself. "Doctor," she called across the ward, "the system no longer flags human fever as spontaneous thermal collapse." Kayles looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Good." He paused, then added with a small smile, "It finally calls it what humans have been calling it all along." At that exact moment, several light years away, Daniel was back underneath an air filtration unit tightening a loose maintenance bracket with a wrench. His communicator buzzed with a message from his mother. It read, "I hope you are eating something besides vending machine snacks." He laughed, slipped the communicator back into his pocket, and returned to work, completely unaware that while he worried about finishing his shift before the weekend, an entire galaxy had quietly rewritten its medical textbooks because one ordinary human had gotten sick, recovered, and simply told the truth about what life on Earth had always been like. Several months later, the story of Daniel Brooks had already begun changing in the retelling. Some claimed he had survived an impossible disease. Others insisted he possessed rare genetics or had secretly participated in military experiments. A few even called him the strongest human ever documented. None of those stories were true. On a quiet Saturday morning outside Columbus, Ohio, Daniel stood in his mother's backyard helping her replace an old wooden fence that had leaned a little farther every winter. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, looked at the crooked post, and smiled. "I told you this thing was ready to fall over." His mother laughed as she handed him another wrench. "I told you that 5 years ago." They spent the afternoon talking about neighbors, football, grocery prices, and whether he was finally going to take a real vacation. Not once did either of them mention the Galactic Medical Council. To them, life had simply returned to normal. Thousands of light years away, however, normal no longer meant the same thing. Medical academies had rewritten entire semesters of coursework. Future physicians now spent weeks studying Terran immune biology before graduating. Human family medicine, once dismissed as primitive compared to galactic technology, had quietly become required reading. Young students memorized a sentence that every Earth parent had known for generations. Listen to the patient. Support the body. Do not mistake every symptom for the enemy. During one lecture, a student asked Professor Lyra the question she had heard hundreds of times. Who discovered the adaptive thermal response? She smiled gently before answering. No single scientist did. Humanity noticed it together, one family at a time, over countless generations. The student seemed surprised. So there was never one great inventor? Lyra shook her head. Sometimes wisdom does not arrive in a laboratory. Sometimes it grows around kitchen tables, inside school classrooms, and beside the beds of sick children. Later that evening, Kaylee's received a short message from Daniel. It contained nothing more than a photograph of a finished wooden fence with the caption, "Back to fixing ordinary things. Hope everybody is doing well." Kaylee's looked at the picture for a long time before quietly saving it. The image would never appear in a medical journal. It would never win an academic award. Yet somehow it reminded him of the lesson that had changed his understanding of humanity more than any scientific paper ever could. Humans rarely thought of themselves as extraordinary. They simply lived, cared for one another, learned from yesterday, and passed those lessons forward without expecting applause. Their greatest strengths were often hidden inside habits so ordinary that they became invisible even to themselves. As the years passed, new discoveries about Terran biology continued to surprise the galaxy. But physicians always remembered where the transformation had truly begun. Not with a famous general. Not with a celebrated scientist. Not with a revolutionary invention. It began with one maintenance engineer who thought he had caught a common illness. One worried mother who calmly repeated advice she had given since he was a little boy, and a handful of doctors willing to admit that everything they believed could be incomplete. Perhaps that is why the story endured long after the medical reports had gathered dust. It reminded people across the galaxy that the greatest mistake is not believing someone is weak. The greatest mistake is believing there is nothing left to learn from ordinary people. Because sometimes the quiet truths that shape the future have been sitting in plain sight all along, waiting for someone humble enough to finally listen.